Hello, it is I, your favorite YouTuber who posts super consistently and never takes, say, month-long breaks. That doesn't ever happen. You're crazy. You're acting crazy. I would never do that. So, we can just drop the subject here. Where have I been for the past month? Okay, fine, I was gone for a month, but now I'm back, and we can finally get back to talking books, baby! I know most of the people that are subscribed to my channel are subscribed for One Piece content exclusively, but I do read a lot of other stuff, and I've been branching out lately, so I think the best way for me to move forward and coming back to this channel is to update all of you with what I've been reading recently. I have read a lot of really good books this year. I'm reading some really good books right now, so I'm gonna give you the 10 best books that I have read this year so far. Caveat, I am not ranking these. These are in totally random order. Only a few of them do I feel are actually safe to make my top 10 list at the end of the year, because I go back and forth, I decide on different things day by day, and I'm also continuing to read books right now, so for all I know, some of these might get pushed out by things I read by the end of the year. It's all so complicated. Anytime I make a top 10 list, I always regret it immediately afterwards, even though I love making top 10 lists. I always regret it immediately afterwards because I change my mind. So I'm not ranking them this time. This time, it's just 10 things in random order. And without further ado, let's hop right into it. First off, we have Jade Legacy. I was blown away by this book. This is definitely one of the safe books on my list to make the top 10 at the end of the year, because this was about as perfect an ending to a trilogy as I have ever seen written. If you don't know, this is book 3 in the series called The Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. I've been pitching this series as The Godfather meets Mistborn in a fictional Asian country controlled by the Yakuza, which is fucking awesome, if you ask me. This is one of those cases where the series progressively got better and better as I went along. I liked Jade City, which was book 1. I thought book 2, Jade War, was great, but Jade Legacy was absolutely show-stopping phenomenal. Fonda Lee is a master at characterizations and dialogues, and that comprises the majority of this series. Combine that with some top-notch world building and politicking, and when I say top-notch, I mean you will be hard-pressed to rival the level of world building and politicking that she pulls off in this series. And having that meshed with some of the best characterizations I have ever encountered results in just this incredible generation-spanning story that I was so heavily invested in that the world felt real and the characters felt real. Very, very real to me. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that this isn't a world that is very removed from our own. It's not Earth, but it is, like, essentially a version of Earth. This is almost urban fantasy, but it's not. And actually, the magic is pretty toned down in this series, and I'm a pretty big fantasy guy. If you know me, you know I love, like, Brandon Sanderson, where the magic is, like, the whole point, right? There's not a whole lot of magic in this. It's there, it is, but it's not, like, super always in your face. It's kind of like a background thing, and it actually becomes more of, like, a resource than something that's fantastical. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much to me when I was this heavily invested in the characters and in the world. And the ending of this book, man, it made me cry so much, and it felt so melancholy and so fitting, and it just, everything came full circle. Every little detail that had kind of been planted throughout the series ended up coming to fruition at some point, and it just was so satisfying on every single level. Alright, next we have a book from a series that has actually been consistently frustrating me. It's The Fires of Heaven, book 5 in The Wheel of Time. Now, don't get me wrong, I am enjoying The Wheel of Time for the most part. I have some gripes with Robert Jordan's writing. I can make an entire video about that. I'm not going to get into that now. I think of the Wheel of Time books that I've read, which I've only read through book 5. I started book 6 and put it down a little bit ago. Wasn't in the mood for it. I think of the 5, The Fires of Heaven was my favorite because this is the one that felt the most epic to me, the most grand in scale, and it felt like we were getting the best characterizations of the main characters that we had gotten throughout the entire series. I still am not like a huge fan of any of the women characters in this series. It's actually one of my biggest problems with Robert Jordan, is that it doesn't feel like he really knows how to write women all that well. But in book 5, you get a lot of Rand al'Thor and Matt Cawthon, and they are, in my opinion, the best characters in the series, and they have a lot of page time, and they have a lot of growth and development, and you see them embodying characteristics that have been set up for them to kind of step into since the beginning of the series, and I really enjoyed seeing that. This also had my favorite battle in the series so far, and there was just a lot of magic and epic things going on just constantly, and I really enjoyed what he did with this book. Even though I wasn't like a huge fan of like half of it that was told from a certain character's perspective that I find to be extremely frustrating, but I digress. We're not talking about things I don't like. I did enjoy this book a lot. This is just classic epic high fantasy, and it felt like some of the promises were being delivered upon in the series at this point. Now we have The Lies of Loch Lamura. I ate this book up. I think I described this on my TikTok page as eating chocolate. This book was absolutely delicious. This isn't like one of my favorite books of all time by any stretch, but I do think that Scott Lynch's prose and his dialogues were so witty and playful, and his plotting was also just so well paced all throughout that I felt like I was just constantly getting hooked in by these little details that just made this world feel so rich. This book is only like 600 something pages, but he has an incredible level of world building packed into there, along with some incredible characters. I mean, they're not like mind-blowing, they're not game-changing, but they are so well realized for what the book is doing. I know some people really love John and Loch, which are like the two main characters of this series, and I do too, but I do think if anything was lacking in this book, it's that it took until past the halfway point for me to really feel like I knew and understood these characters. It took a while for them to feel super approachable to me because we spend so much of this book focused on the plot and the world, but those things to me actually ended up serving a purpose because of the way that this book is written. It's so, like I said, it's so witty and it's so playful that it kind of makes you feel like the characters are in on some kind of joke that you're missing out on, and I actually enjoyed that feeling. I came to appreciate the fact that Scott Lynch holds us at arm's length as a reader. Like, we are never fully there on the ground with John and Loch. Like, we're there with them, but we're not like in their shoes, you know, for the majority of this book, which in a book like this, which is very much a cat's cradle, it's nice to not have all the info and to not just be seeing every single little detail unravel in real time, because it keeps you interested, it keeps you curious as to what's going on and how they're going to get out of situations, and I enjoyed that aspect of the book. Okay, and this next book is actually the last book that I finished. I finished it like just a few days ago. It's Harrow the Ninth. This book blew my goddamn mind, and I'm so surprised that I liked it as much as I did, because I wasn't like a huge fan of Gideon the Ninth, which is the first book in this series. I wasn't like super into it, and that might have had something to do with the fact that I was reading it at like a turbulent time in my life, but also I just wasn't like super into it. So when I picked up the sequel, I was actually really skeptical. This book had to run uphill for me to really get into it, and the fact that it's so inaccessible and it still managed to do that is astounding to me. This is perhaps the most confusing book I've ever read. It's like a bad acid trip, but in a good way somehow. The majority of this book is told from like second person perspective, so it's saying you did this, you did that, which was already kind of a jarring creative choice, but also Tamsin Muir, the author, she has a way of writing that is so eclectic at all times. She never takes the obvious route in anything, and never in dialogues, in descriptions, in action. Nothing is ever exactly what you think it's gonna be. She has such strange word choices that keep you, again, I love when authors do this and they do it right. They keep you at arm's length because you don't know what's going on in this book for the majority of it until like the last 15%. You're just scratching your head going, what the fuck is happening? Like, you're so confused. But the thing that kept me in, the thing that kept me reading this book, it was hard to put down, was that the pacing and the mysteries were so engaging. I never felt like there was a dull moment in this book. And it also leans a lot heavier into the magic of this book, which is necromancy. I love necromancy. I wish there was more of it in fantasy books, and there's a lot of necromancy in this book. And it's also just really digging into the mysteries behind that magic, which is so fascinating to me, because necromancy in general is a very mysterious art, you know, Like, okay, people can summon dead, skeletons from the grave, but like how, Because, I mean, obviously every magic system is different, but that's such an interesting choice to then go into why, well, what's going on here? This book also does a lot of timeline hopping, and it kind of gaslights you about the events of the first book, which is extremely confusing. Like I said, I can't do justice to how confusing this book is. It is genuinely like the most complicated puzzle box of a plot that I have ever encountered. Like, it is genuinely just mind-blowingly insane. But I got the vision. I understood what Tamsin Muir was doing. I got what she was going for, and I totally bought into it. And the last 15% were so satisfying, and they resolved everything so well that I loved it, man. I fucking loved this book, and I didn't think I was going to. In fact, I went into it expecting to hate it. And it's special when a book that you are going in with bias against makes you fall in love with it anyway. I mean, come on. That's just, how do you pull that off? Okay, I have been so excited to talk about this book. The next book on my list is Lightbringer, book 6 in Red Rising. Oh my god, I could have included pretty much any of the Red Rising books on this list. They're all so freaking good in my opinion, but this one, I think, is my new favorite in the series. Red Rising is the definition of a sci-fi epic. It is massive in scale, and the cast of characters and factions and cohorts that have been introduced into this series is absolutely massive. So what Pierce Brown does in Lightbringer is he scales back. He comes back to the core of what Red Rising was at the beginning of the series, which is focusing on the protagonist Darrow and his core group of friends. Ever since the original trilogy, there's been somewhat of a disconnect from the main character Darrow and everything that's going on. I mean, he's always involved in it, but we aren't as intimate with him as a reader as we were in that original trilogy, because there's new points of view, there's new places, and there's a lot of things going on outside of his storyline. So scaling it back and coming back to just being in his head and figuring out his psyche and seeing him grapple with this war that has been going on for over a decade at this point, and seeing how he has been affected by all these decisions and all of these things that he's done over the years, and seeing how his friends are kind of going through the same thing, and watching them overcome those things, watching them confront those things and come to grips with who they are as people now is just so beautiful. This is, in my opinion, Pierce Brown's best character work by far. And he does all of this while retaining the key aspects of Red Rising that make it so lovable in the first place, aka massive action set pieces and galaxy sweeping politicking. I mean, he still does all of that shit, and he breaks your heart, he makes you laugh, he makes you stand up and cheer, he does all of the things that they say on the dust jacket, he actually accomplishes all of that. This book was astounding. Like, I don't know how he pulled off bringing together so many moving parts and setting up the conclusion to the series and giving us, resolutions to character arcs and giving us satisfaction emotionally. I just don't know how he did it. I don't know how he managed all of those things at once. It's astounding. Anyways, that's all I'll say for now, because I do plan on ranking all of the Red Rising books later this week, so we're gonna leave that there. Okay, final 5 here. So now we have The Dark Tower, book 7 in the Dark Tower series. This is probably the most flawed book on this list. I definitely have issues with some of the decisions that Stephen King made in the narrative in this final book, but I actually loved the resolution, albeit with a caveat that there's a showdown that happens at the end of this book that was pretty unsatisfying to me, but the actual ending I thought was extremely fitting thematically and narratively. I know some people hate the ending of The Dark Tower. I personally loved it. It's okay if you don't like it. I get it. It's extremely polarizing, but everything else about the book, apart from, the things that I didn't enjoy, it did deliver very much on the emotional stakes that had been set for this series. I cried like 3 or 4 times reading this book, and it felt like a part of me was being ripped away every single time something horrible happened in this book. Because by the time you're at the end of this series, you've spent the majority of it with this quartet, this core group, this core cast of characters, and there's 4 of them, 5 of them, and they're all been together on this weird, wacky, crazy journey to the Dark Tower. You've been with them through hell and back. You've seen them in scenarios that are absolutely insane, and they've come out the other side, and the one thing that has always been at the center of this series is their connection with each other, and that needed to remain the core of what happened in this book, and I think that that's one of the few things that Stephen King really, really lands on most of the time with his books. This book and this series also just hold a special place in my heart because they are the most out there, crazy fantasy that I have ever read, and it feels like I broadened my horizons in a lot of ways, and I got a taste of what fantasy can be outside of the normal, classic high fantasy swords and sorcery kind of stuff, because that's mostly what I've read. I mean, I've read iterations of that, but this is the first time that it doesn't even remotely resemble like what I'm used to reading in fantasy, and I enjoyed it a lot, and it's made me open up my mind in a lot of ways to other possibilities for the genre, and that I owe a lot to that, I think. Alright, and this was bound to happen. I have a Brandon Sanderson book on here. It's Tress of the Emerald Sea. I honestly did not think I was going to enjoy this book as much as I did, because Brandon Sanderson, the things I like about him the most are his epic scale and his focus on the intricate magic systems and the epic moments and all of these incredible character interactions and stuff, and that's just not what this book is at all. This is like a pretty cozy story, and there is a really cool world and a really cool magic system that he implements seamlessly. It's actually kind of astounding the way that he pulls that off, because this is not a book that's focused on those things. They exist in this story and in this world, but they are not the main draw of why you're reading the story, and so the fact that he pulls that off is really mind-blowing when I sit down and really think about it, the fact that he did that, because at the core of this story, it's an emotional journey of a girl who is going to go save the man that she loves. That is literally the plot. It's The Princess Bride, but reversed, essentially. And in there's some really heartwarming and touching and funny moments. And this book was such a pleasure. It was such a delight. Like, how I described The Lies of Loch Lamura as eating chocolate? This is like eating like a nice fluffy slice of cake. It was just so satisfying. This book wasn't trying to be anything groundbreaking. It just is what it is, and it does what it does super well. I really, really enjoyed this book. Alright, moving on. Now we have The Name of the Wind. I had this book hyped into fucking oblivion for me, so my expectations were extremely high going into this book. I had a level of skepticism because of that. I wasn't really sure if it was going to be as good as everyone says, and I don't think it quite is. Like, I think it's a great book, but I don't think it's like one of the best books ever written, as a lot of people in the fantasy community made me believe, but that's okay, because it was still excellent. Like, I still think it was like a damn near perfect book for what it was. I mean, I gave it, I think, a 9 out of 10 when I ranked it. It was excellent. I don't want to like get on anyone's bad side, but I don't think it's like one of the greatest books I've ever read in my life, and that's kind of how it was hyped to me. But again, we're not here to talk about the things that I don't enjoy about books. This is excellently written. Patrick Rothfuss undeniably has beautiful and accessible prose that is present in basically every single page of this book, and it's a book that's like 800, 900 pages. That's a crazy thing to pull off. When you can continually impress me with your prose throughout a length that long, I mean, that's just, how do you do that? Like, actually, genuinely, how do you refine so many of your words and sentences into such a beautiful way of reading for a book that is almost 1,000 pages? How do you do that? But beyond Patrick Rothfuss's prose, I actually really enjoyed this plot. That's something that I had seen a lot of criticisms of, and I guess I understand where they come from, but it seemed to me like this entire story is somewhat of a commentary on legends and stories and how they're never quite as epic and amazing as people tell them to be, especially in a world like this where, there's not cameras and shit. No one really knows what happens. And the main character, Koth, however you say it, he's been built up to be this legend. And so when he's telling his story and you're getting the raw, unfiltered version of it, which is actually kind of debatable because I think he's somewhat of an unreliable narrator, but regardless, his version of events is stripped down and it's not ever as insane and out there and wacky as the stories would leave you to believe. And in this book, there's a lot of themes that kind of revolve around that entire theme, That was a weird sentence. That's not exactly what I meant to say. You know what I mean. They're all built around that exact idea that stories aren't exactly what you think they are. And that's what the whole point of the book is, to me, at least. And I enjoyed that Patrick Rothfuss was taking it that route instead of it just being, here's this really cool guy and here's all the really cool things that he's done. When in reality, he was just a scared kid who was a little bit arrogant at times and was just kind of floundering his way through life and doing what he could. And I really enjoyed that that's what the story is. It surprised me, it caught me off guard, but I enjoyed getting this more stripped down fantasy story when I was expecting something from the very beginning that was going to be very different. Also, a lot of this book takes place in a magic school, and I'm always here for that shit. The magic itself is very interesting. It's sympathy, and I don't really know how to explain it, but it's actually a pretty interesting system, and I find the protagonist to be very compelling. He's a very flawed individual, but I am here for flawed characters. I enjoy it when a character's not just perfect in every way, even though he's kind of perfect at a lot of the things that he tries. He, as a person, is very flawed, which I think is an interesting dichotomy to introduce into a character. Alright, and second to last here, we have Underlord. This is book 6 of the Cradle series. This is actually just the most recent Cradle book that I've read. I think I could put any of them past book 3 in this slot, because really this is just a stand-in for my enjoyment of the Cradle series as a whole. When I started Cradle, I wasn't like super hot on it. The first book is like fine. I think it's good. Like it does enough for like setting up the magic system in the world, which is kind of where the series needs to build off of, because these books are very bite-sized. They're like never longer than probably 300 something pages, and that's like the longest ones are over 300 pages. Most of them are shorter than that. So they're very bite-sized and they're very action-packed and they're very focused on the fights, because the fights are built around advancing, and the character, he starts at, essentially in video games terms, he starts at level 0 and he's working his way up. And that's not exactly what it is, but that's essentially the entire concept of the series, is this character starts out as someone who can't use the magic, who can't fight, and he becomes powerful, and he becomes more and more powerful, and his enemies become more and more powerful, and it's about the advancement of all of that. And that on the way that I'm delivering that, it doesn't sound super interesting, but Cradle is actually a lot more than that. That's just the core concept of what's going on within the plot, but it's actually surprised me in the way that it's expanded so much in scale, and it's introduced so many incredible characters. There's a character that I love. His name is Ethan Aurelius, and he's one of my favorite fantasy characters of all time. I love him. He's funny, he's fun to watch, he's just, every scene he's in is so electrifying, and it's so great to have him on the page every single time. And also the main character's relationship with who is basically the secondary protagonist has been super endearing, and also just so fun to watch develop over time, because they start out in such different places and then they come to care about each other. And on top of all that, there's awesome fights, and there's a lot of really cool just people getting stronger, and you get to see how he goes from being a weakling to being someone who is feared, and everyone's like, holy shit, this guy's terrifying. That's fun stuff, but it's built on this foundation of actually good characters and a world that is super fascinating. There's a lot of really interesting things that Will White introduces into this world, and I actually think it's a very colorful and vibrant world, and I enjoy that kind of stuff. So this series has surprised me. It has kind of knocked my socks off at points, and I didn't think it was going to do that at any point. So Cradle is excellent. Also, it's like as close as you can get to like a shonen anime in book form, and I love that. Okay, we're on the final book, and I actually didn't mean to save this for last, but I think it's fitting that I did save this for last, because I think this is my favorite book I've read so far this year. It's The Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie. Oh boy, where do I even start? Where do I even start talking about this? Because Joe Abercrombie and the First Law world in general, because this is all the First Law trilogy, they have just become like one of my favorite series, and Joe Abercrombie has become potentially my favorite author ever. I think he is a genius storyteller. I think he is an absolute unmitigated genius. He is so good at what he does. This book, The Last Argument of Kings, is the final book of the First Law trilogy, and what Joe Abercrombie does in this book is so ballsy. It's so well done that I literally had my jaw on the floor. I was sat there like this with my hand on my head for like the last 100 pages, because I couldn't believe the route that he was taking narratively and thematically, but it worked so well because it had been set up from the very beginning. I don't want to say too much, but Joe Abercrombie is a very cynical writer. The stories he's telling are not stories that are super happy. Everyone's going to have a great resolution. Everyone's a good person that you're following. Every single character in this series is morally gray. They all make decisions that you're probably going to disagree with, and they've all done things in their past that you're probably going to hate them for. This isn't a story where the good guys win and everyone has an emotional resolution to their character arc that is super satisfying and that leaves you smiling. Actually, none of that happens. Literally none of that happens. I think this is the most thematically sound ending to a series I have ever encountered. Literally everything that happened was in line with the themes that Joe Abercrombie set up from the very, very, very beginning of the story. And speaking of that, this book also recontextualizes the first two books in the series, and I didn't really love The Blade itself, which is book one. I love it now because I see how masterfully he set everything up in that book, and I just didn't notice what he was doing at the time because there's no way for you to know what he's doing, and I can't say more than that for the sake of spoilers, but holy crap, the way that he wrote the ending of this trilogy just blew my mind. It was so phenomenal on every single reveal, every single character ending, every single battle, every single thing that happened was just so goddamn satisfying. Also, Joe Abercrombie is a master at writing battle scenes, and this book has a couple of my favorite battle scenes ever put to page. Oh god. I'll stop talking about this because I've talked about this book before on my channel and I don't want to say too much, but if you haven't read the first Law trilogy, if you plan on picking it up, don't just read the first book. Get to the end of that trilogy because the ending is so goddamn worth it. I know some people hate the ending because they wanted it to be the storybook ending and it's just not that at all, but holy fuck, I loved it so much. Anyways, those are the top 10 books that I've read so far this year. This is definitely going to change. The book that I'm currently reading is probably going to end up on this list, and I have a couple of books listed throughout the rest of this year that I'm probably going to end up really loving that I think might boot out a couple of these, but for now, I feel pretty good about this list. Let me know what your top 10 books of the year are. I'm always so interested to see what other people are reading and enjoying, so please do leave your list in the comments below. I would just also love to get some recommendations out of those lists, so that would be awesome. But anyways, I'm gonna start posting more regularly from here on out. I'm gonna attempt to do every Tuesday and Thursday. That might be ambitious after taking a month off, but we'll see. We'll see. You can't stop me. You can't tell me that I'm not gonna do it, even though there's a lot of evidence that I don't follow through on those promises, but whatever, who cares? And also, if you've stuck around this long, if you're enjoying this video, you should check out my Patreon. It's in the link in the description. It's a great tight-knit community, even though I don't post very often in there sometimes. I also want to be posting like every Friday in there, and I'm going to try and set up like a book club. I did try and do that last month. It didn't work super well. I'm still working out the kinks, but the more people that join, the more pressure that's on me, and I work best when I'm under pressure, so your move. Okay, but seriously, I do think the Patreon is a great place. I post some extra stuff on there, and that's a good way to interact with me one-on-one if you really want to, because there's not very many people in the Patreon, and it's a great place to get my attention, I guess, if you want that. I don't know why you would want that, but, it's a thing. Anyways, until next time, I hope you're happy and healthy, I hope you're doing well, and I will see you then. Bye-bye!